Hi, I'm Heather Darch, and this is a presentation by the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. In this series called Raising Spirits, we're telling the stories of our vanishing heritage. Many early villages established in Quebec's Laurentians have left behind sparse reminders of their existence. At one time, though, these little hamlets represented an act of faith and hope for the first settlers, and a belief that a better future and opportunities could be secured for generations to come. Economic disappointments and the lure of bigger centers often meant that small communities struggled and declined. Abandonment, neglect, and even arson have erased what once was in this small community. This is Shrewsbury.
My connection to this part of the world really started almost 50 years ago when I moved from the city to the country as part of the young people of that era were thinking of back to the land being the place. This was the back to the land that I came to. Well, I'm Don Stewart. I live in Morin Heights in the Laurentians north of Montreal. I guess my main claim to fame is the book that I wrote, The History of Morin Heights, L'Histoire de Morin Heights, because it was translated into both languages. We are in Shrewsbury, one of the vanished villages of Argenteuil, and there are actually 35 different ones that we've identified that are now no more than a dot on a topographical map. Right now we're standing about halfway between Lachute and Morin Heights, only a mile or two in from Highway 329. This particular house I rented because I knew the family, the lady, the artist who had lived here, and she wanted to rent her house out. For me, it was an opportunity to leave Montreal behind and live in a historic building. This house is an 1834 original farmhouse. Beneath the exterior that was added in the 60s or 70s is a square log house, still original. The interior is quite original. This was the home of Captain Good. He was a captain in the local militia, the Argenteuil Rangers, that were formed to fight the Fenians in the 1860s. This house, the nearest neighbor is a mile away. Today there's a few new houses, but when I lived here for 2 years in the 1970s, it was a mile to the nearest neighbor. And very similar in many ways, I guess, to the pioneer experience. It was quiet. There was maybe one car a day that went by. And it was similar in many ways to where my ancestors had come from Scotland, to Harrington and Brownsburg and little vanished villages there. This gave me a sense of the same experience that they must have had when they first came to Canada. Just about all of the pioneers that came to this part of the world came from Ireland or Scotland, came across the ocean in a long 6-week journey, and most of them came through Montreal and up the Ottawa River to St. Andrews near Lachute. Shrewsbury, there were 40 families or more that lived in this very particular area. Most of them arrived in the 1830s, 1840s, some in the 1820s, but they didn't get land title until the 1830s. But from St. Andrews, those that were granted land up here, they would walk like 15 or 20 kilometers up to here and try and turn this forest into farmland. Most of them had a couple of cows and a few pigs and a few chickens. It wasn't farming on a grand scale, it was subsistence farming. There were maybe 50 magnificent old barns. The one that's behind me is the only surviving one that I'm aware of now, and it's perhaps more magnificent than most were because it was a poor community. The original pioneers here, of course, faced great challenges. There were bears. They had to forage for food, for berries in their first year. The land didn't produce much in the way of food. They certainly had gardens, but the soil was so rocky and so thin that it was a huge challenge. Communications, of course, if they didn't have a horse, they had to walk, and the nearest neighbor would be at least a mile away. In the 1860s and 1870s, this particular house was the post office for the community. It was at its prime in the 1870s, maybe 1880s, before people started moving away. They moved away, of course, because the land was no good for agriculture. And there was no railway, there was no lake, there was no stream, there was no mill, there was no reason for people to stay. Places like Manitoba were calling, and that's where many of the people from here immigrated to. The post office, of course, was one of the few ways that they communicated with the outside world. Even an expedition to Lachute for the big spring fair, the horse fair, even that was a long walk, like 15 or 20 kilometers away, and that made it a full-day expedition. There were no hospitals, of course, no grocery stores, none of the modern conveniences that we take for granted these days. These little roads were originally small trails for people on foot and horses. Later, buggies and, of course, Model T Fords and stuff came in. But there's not a lot of houses. Compared to what there was 100 years ago, there would have been houses every few hundred meters along here because this is still pretty much the center of the original village of Shrewsbury. This old gravel road, of course, was Highway 30, the main highway between Morin Heights and Lachute, until the mid-1980s. That's hard to believe that it was so recent. But like everything else in Shrewsbury, it has deteriorated to the point where it's being closed as a road now. Somewhere in here is an old foundation from one of the many old homesteads here. Here's a depression. That was probably a barn or something there. There it is. It's quite amazing that this is all that's left of a homestead where a family lived for several generations in the 19th century. I don't know much about this specific homestead, but the foundation is here. It's approximately 24 feet square, which is about the size of most of the original square log houses that the pioneers built, usually in their second year here. First year would be just a little lean-to kind of hut, and then they'd fell some trees and use those logs to build a cabin. Most of the settlers in Shrewsbury were Irish. Actually, most of this county of Argenteuil was Irish and Scottish. There weren't a lot of Francophone families. There were 20 miles that way and 20 miles that way, but not in this immediate area. So the neighbors were all English speaking. There was actually an Orange Lodge only a few hundred meters from where we're standing, because this is close to the center of the original village here. The 12th of July was one of the big celebrations of the year when all of the neighbors would come together and celebrate the defeat of the Catholics by Protestant William of Orange several hundred years ago. But that was the big social event of the year. This is one of the few remaining original square log cabins in Shrewsbury. There were at least 40 of them similar to this in the 1830s and 1840s. The construction techniques are quite obvious at the corner where the logs are, I don't know the term, dovetailed perhaps, together to form a very strong corner. I think this is the only one where the square logs are still visible. And the loft upstairs would be where the kids slept, because most families in those days were large. And the ones in Shrewsbury probably had 6 or 8 or 10 children. And they all lived comfortably in buildings exactly like this one, of certainly less than the size of the smallest bungalows of today. On a hot summer day, when the wood stove was the only way of cooking, it'd make the house too hot. So they had what they called a summer kitchen. And in the summer, they would move the big old wood stove from inside the house out to this outbuilding that was much better ventilated. And this one was built later. It's clapboard, so it would be maybe from the 1890s or very early in the 20th century. I don't think the chimney would be original, and of course the tin roof isn't original, but everything else is pretty close to the way it was very close to 200 years ago. And for this part of the world, that's old. We're standing here in downtown Shrewsbury, the center of the community that started in the 1830s and really continued up until the 20th century. St. John's Anglican Church, which was right here, built in 1858, was a very simple white painted wooden structure with a bit of a bell tower. At one point the door was painted red, but that was unusual for these dour old Scots and Irishmen. The interior of the church, of course, was spectacular. Simple, natural wood right until the end. No fancy statues, no great altar, just very simple Puritan kind of structure. But it was the center of the community. Across the street from it was the Orange Hall, where all the social events happened. There was a little schoolhouse and many pioneer farmhouses within a mile of where we're standing at this point. The church has a sad history. It stopped being used as a church more than once a year for legal reasons up until the 1970s or 80s. After that, it was really abandoned, but taken care of. The Anglicans did a good job of creating little churches every few miles in all of Argentine County. And this one they took care of. But on the internet, somewhere in the 1990s, it got a reputation as a haunted church. And people used to turn up and started vandalizing it. There was a lot of vandalism. And finally, 10 years ago or so, the church burned down under circumstances that everyone assumes was arson. Too bad, because it was a very beautiful little church, and everybody in the community of Shrewsbury attended services on Sunday. Now all of those people are behind me, of course. This is the only cemetery in the community of Shrewsbury. And I don't know, there's 50 or more stones here, commemorative stones. And in the cemetery here is a stone of Captain William Good and Patricia Good, who was the artist that did the drawings for the novel. The novel Land Possessed was written in 1970 by Margaret Cook. It's probably the best historical romance novel to ever come out of these parts of the world. The drawings in it were done by Patricia Good. She's the lady that I rented the old house from. She's part of the original Good family. But it was the inspiration for a play that I wrote in 2005 called Nature's Victory, which in turn was inspired by a painting of Pat Good of a falling down building here, which sort of symbolized the fact that the pioneers fought against nature to try and turn this into civilized farmland, but nature won. It was nature's victory. The trees grew back, the farms disappeared, people moved away. Cemeteries always make me, and I guess everybody, a little reflective about life and death and how things change, how a community like Shrewsbury, that was a thriving community, has totally disappeared. Nobody remembers it. Should we remember it? Well, it's part of our history, it's part of our heritage. It's, for many people, it's part of their personal family background. I love coming down to Shrewsbury. The cemetery and the area has fond memories of when I was a young man living here. It was a great time in my life. It was a turning point in my life. So every time I come here, it reminds me of all the good things that can happen to one during their lifetime.